Published 0638 EDT, the 22nd of August 2017. Updated 0804 EDT, the 22nd of August 2017. Unable to vote, sit on a jury or graduate from Oxbridge. 100 years ago, women in Britain were treated as second-class citizens. It sparked the rise of the suffragettes, a movement of brave women led by political activist Emmeline Pankhurst, who used controversial and occasionally violent means of protest to campaign for equality and the right to vote. Now this rare set of harrowing images reveal the scale of the human cost of their struggle, showing gaunt, frail suffragettes imprisoned and showing defiance from their jail cells. In one haunting image from 1913, suffragette Olivia Wary is pictured weighing just 5 stone 9 pounds after a grueling 32-day hunger strike in Holloway Prison, while another shows an inmate being force-fed through a tube over fears she could die a martyr. But their fight eventually led to a historic move almost a century ago, when women over 30 were finally granted the right to vote in 1918. Pictured left, a suffragette on hunger strike being forcibly fed with a nasal tube whilst in Holloway Prison, circa 1911. Meanwhile, suffragette Olive Wary is pictured on hunger strike in the same prison in 1913. In this shocking photograph, she is seen weighing just 5 stone 9 pounds after a grueling 32-day hunger strike. Suffragettes Evelina Haverfield and Emmeline Pankhurst write in court, circa 1909. In 1903, Mrs. Pankhurst set up the Women's Social and Political Union (WSPU) for a more militant approach to gaining the vote, after the limited success of the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies, set up in 1897, which believed in enfranchising women by peaceful means. Flora Drummond pictured at the front and other suffragettes are placed under arrest. Sometime in 1914, the union's motto was deeds not words, and many of their actions were considered extreme by the population. They include large rallies and hunger strike surveillance photos taken by British police of members of the suffragette movement. Top row LR Mary Raleigh Richardson, Lillian Lenton, Kitty Marion Katharina Maria Schaefer, Lillian Forrester. Bottom row LR Miss Johansson, Clara Givine, Jenny Baines, Miriam Pratt. Lillian Lenton number 13 described being force-fed in prison as the most intolerable and intense pain, and she became seriously ill with pleurisy caused by food entering her lungs. Suffragettes and convicts Evelyn Manesta and Lillian Forrester are pictured as they talk a walk together in Manchester Prison, sometime in 1913. The photograph was taken covertly by the police as they sought to curtail the militant suffragette movement, although it would be a long road to equality. The practice of hunger strikes, common among suffragettes in prison, did long-term damage to the physical and mental health of the suffragettes. Lillian Lenton described being force-fed in prison as the most intolerable and intense pain, and she became seriously ill with pleurisy caused by food entering her lungs. Eventually, authorities passed the Cat and Mouse Act in 1913, a law that allowed them to set hunger-striking suffragettes free and arrest them the second they had eaten a morsel of food. The suffragette movement dates back to the mid-1800s, when Mary Smith delivered the first women's suffrage petition to Parliament in 1832. Later that same year, the General Reform Act confirmed that women would remain excluded from the vote. In 1866, the National Society for Women's Suffrage was formed. The National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies (NUWSS) was formed in 1897 and led by Millicent Garrett Fawcett. In 1903, Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst set up the Women's Social and Political Union (WSPU) for a more militant approach to gaining the vote. In 1918, the Representation of the People Act was passed, allowing men over 21 and women over 30 to vote. An amendment to the Act 10 years later allowed everyone over 21 to vote. Suffragettes in their cells at Holloway Prison are pictured waving through the bars, circa 1909. In prison, many suffragettes went on hunger strikes. Fearing that these women would become martyrs, prison guards started force-feeding them to keep them alive, strapping them down and jamming tubes up their noses. A crowd gathers to welcome Mary Lee after her release from prison in London, 1908. She joined the Women's Social and Political Union (WSPU) in 1906. 4 years after her release, in Dublin, she threw a hatchet at serving Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith, but she hit Irish nationalist leader John Redmond instead, leaving him badly injured. The arrest of Flora Drummond, Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst pictured left to right, 1908. Flora Drummond was nicknamed the General, due to her habit of leading marches whilst wearing a military-style uniform and cap and riding on a large horse. She was also known for her oratory skills, and was said to be able to put down a heckler with ease. Christabel Pankhurst, Flora Drummond and Emmeline Pankhurst in court, 1908. All three played a major role in the success and exposure of the Women's Social and Political Union, and were regularly brought before the courts. The group was known for physical confrontations, with members encouraged to smash windows and assault police officers. Surveillance photos taken by British police of members of the suffragette movement. Top row LR Margaret Scott, Olive Laird-Nay Hawken, Margaret McFarlane, Mary Wyan, Mary Ellen Taylor, Annie Bell. Bottom row LR Jane Short, Gertrude Mary Ansell, Maud Brindley, Verity Oates, Evelyn Maynard. Portrait of suffragette Lillian Forrester whilst in prison is shown left. Shown right, a mock prison cell for suffragettes erected at the women's exhibition held at Prince's Skating Rink in Knightsbridge, May 1909. Suffragettes Christabel Pankhurst, right, with Annie Kenney, circa 1910. Kenney was the only working-class woman to become part of the senior hierarchy of the Women's Social and Political Union, becoming deputy of the group in 1912, an unusual occurrence in a middle-class organization. Emmeline Pankhurst pictured poses in a mock prison dress during a protest, circa 1911. The women's suffrage movement began in the mid-1800s as organized campaigns began to take place across the UK after Mary Smith delivered the first women's suffrage petition to Parliament. In 1866, a women's suffrage committee was formed in London, which soon sparked other groups being set up in other areas, such as the Manchester National Society for Women's Suffrage. Millicent Garrett Fawcett led the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies NUWSS, which was set up in 1897. They were known as suffragists, as they believed in enfranchising women by peaceful means such as protests and petitions. They stayed away from violence. But Emmeline Pankhurst, who was then a member of the NUWSS, decided to employ more direct and militant tactics, leading her to set up the Women's Social and Political Union WSPU in 1906 with her two daughters, Sylvia and Christabel. The union's motto was deeds not words, and many of their actions were considered extreme by the population. They include large rallies and hunger strikes. Another group, the Women's Freedom League WFL, was set up a year later by Charlotte Despard and Teresa Billington Greig, and were somewhere in between the other two groups in regards to their approach. But the onset of World War I changed the minds of many opposed to suffrage. Prime Minister Herbert Asquith declared his support of women's suffrage in 1916. Women over 30 were finally granted the right to vote in 1918, and 10 years later, the Representation of the People Act was amended to allow everyone over the age of 21 to vote.